Motion inputs have been a staple in fighting games for many years. It is ingrained in the DNA of the genre itself. However, motion inputs can be intimidating for newer players and beginners. One of the more common points brought up when talking to friends and acquaintances about fighting games is that the execution barrier is intimidating and very tough. And that is why you see games like Smash Bros. Outside of having a large roster of very well-known IPs, be way more inviting in terms of getting people from the beginner level to the intermediate and even the advanced level, is because of their simple controls. However, those of you who play competitive Smash or have dabbled in competitive Smash know that things like movement, combos, ledge trapping, neutral are not easy and simple in Smash Bros. There are a lot of nuances to how you control the character when playing near or at the professional level. Street Fighter 6 is implementing a modern control, which is basically a simplified, easy input mode, where the players can execute special moves like Hadouken and with the press of a button and a direction, or a super art with the press of 2 buttons and a direction, which eliminates motion inputs. And while I do see that execution can be an intimidating factor for most players, I do think that Capcom has to be careful because of one particular reason. The way to get good at a fighting game is not so much the execution, that is a big part of it, but it's actually the decision-making process. If your execution was immaculate and you could perform the highest damaging combo for your character, but you needed to land a specific hit in a specific scenario, but that scenario never comes up, then you're never going to be able to do that damage. This is important because now we're separating execution from decision-making. Decision-making will allow you to do those combos, to execute on your plan, and to wrap up the game. But you need to make those decisions to get you to where you need to be first. So now you're probably thinking, well, if I didn't have to worry about execution, I could worry about making decisions and getting better at that. And I do agree with that. Eliminating that barrier that is execution may get people to the decision-making process much faster, but sadly it is not that simple. Decision-making in fighting games are intrinsically tied to execution. What I mean by this is that most moves that are very powerful or have a lot of advantages are usually tied to more complex input or inputs that stop you from being able to block. If I wanted to optimally punish a jump in on me in a fighting game, which is somebody just jumping at you, I would want to anti-air with a shoryuken, a dragon punch, which means on the controller I would have to press forward, down forward, forward, and a punch. This means that I can't be blocking at any time while I'm doing this motion unless I'm cheating or something like that. Doing this is the most optimal thing for me because it gives me the most damage and the best knockdown, whatever the advantage would be. And what amount of advantage you generate is dependent on game to game. I could also use an universal anti-air like a 6P in Guilty Gear or a down heavy punch in Street Fighter 5. Those two options are not as damaging and optimal and gives me less advantage, but they are more consistent and less committal. The input itself is just forward and a button or down and a button, so I lower the execution barrier, meaning I'll have less of a chance to drop the input, and if I were to whiff or miss with my attacks, I will be able to recover faster and prevent myself from dying. Comparative to doing a shoryuken or a dragon punch and missing, I'll be in the air for a little bit, and when I land, I'm still vulnerable and susceptible to being comboed for quite a bit of time. This option between the easier anti-air and the harder anti-air is the core of why I think motion inputs are important to fighting games, or 2D fighting games in particular. The scenario that I just mentioned to you is from a defensive posture. I'm defending myself against somebody aggressing on me. And depending on how close they are to me or how fast I think I can react, I may do different things. If I'm confident I can do the input in time, I'll just let it rip and do a shoryuken. But if I'm hesitant on how fast he's coming in at me and my ability to do that motion in the moment, I might resort to a more consistent and easy to perform input. On the opposite hand, as somebody who loves to play rushdown and offense, the most important thing for me in running my offense is understanding how hard or how easy it is for my opponent to counter me. So if they're playing somebody who has a really easy input for their anti-air option or some kind of reversal option, I'm going to have a much more reserved time in terms of approaching them. I may not jump in as much, and a lot of my block strings and offensive setups will have to be accounting for that shoryuken or DP that they can do at a moment's notice. And using a real-world example, Grand Blue Fantasy Versus also has an easy input mode and even a block button. So traditionally in fighting games, you have to hold away from the direction of your opponent to block, and you also have to block high or low, meaning you have to be standing to block high attacks and crouching to block low attacks. This means that blocking, the act of defending, is a decision based on motion. And one of the issues that I had with Granblue Fantasy Versus and the block button was that the price for using the block button was non-existent. You built less meter when you block with the guard button, and you still have to block high or low, but you no longer have to hold away from the enemy. This is super important because now you have options to where you can block at a moment's notice from a forward position. You don't have to press back anymore, and if your opponents were to switch sides on you immediately or at a rapid pace, you just have to hold the block button and you don't have to worry too much about what side of the field they are on. Now, this introduces two big problems to fighting games in general. One, the defensive player no longer has to care if their opponent is behind them, in front of them, whatever. And the offensive player can no longer use strategies that revolve around screen switching and so on and so forth. The second way is by removing that input, you now have option selects, which allows more advanced players to abuse the block button, situations where they otherwise wouldn't be able to block, allowing them to gain more advantage over a new or intermediate player. This is exactly the same for easy specials. In Granblue Fantasy Versus, the cost of using an easy special input is that the special that you perform actually goes on cooldown for a couple seconds and you cannot use it again. But if you were to tie this to an invincible Shoryuken uppercut DP, for example, it wouldn't matter. Because when you let that invincible Shoryuken DP rip, regardless of it whiffs or if it hits, the next time you're going to want to use a Shoryuken will not be within the cooldown's time. So realistically, for an intermediate or advanced player, this is not a downside. In terms of utilizing the easy input in neutral, why wouldn't you? You can now react to things that you otherwise wouldn't be able to because you had to input that Shoryuken motion in the first place. What I'm trying to say is, modern inputs or easy inputs can be really overpowered in the hands of a professional player who has already learned the decision-making process that is so important to fighting games. And yes, you might be able to get to the decision-making process sooner if you didn't have to worry about your execution, but like I mentioned before, your decision-making process, whether it be on offense or defense, is intrinsically tied to motion inputs itself. So either the game has to be balanced around easy inputs, or the easy inputs have to have a meaningful downside to them, so that way people are encouraged to go use the traditional controls and do the motion inputs. For Street Fighter 6, I think the best way that they can probably handle this is for the easy specials. Perhaps Capcom can add more recovery frames to the moves that are being used, maybe it doesn't grant hard knockdown, and of course the damage should not be the same as a motion input. It should not be as rewarding for somebody to press one direction on a button as compared to somebody doing a motion and then the button. And as far as I can tell, in Street Fighter 6's modern controls, there is no guard or block button to speak of, so I'm really happy about that. I think the guard button really dumbs down the game in a not good way for both the offensive and defensive side. And that's pretty much my concern with easy inputs or modern inputs, and I hope that Street Fighter 6 and their dev team is learning from Granblue Fantasy Versus' easy input as well, and not making the same mistakes that they did, or at least I feel like they did, where the easy inputs and the guard button had no downsides to their actions at all. What are your thoughts on this? Let me know in the comments below. Do you like modern easy inputs? Do you think it should be balanced better, or do you think they should carry the same advantages as a motion input? My name is Varsona, and I'll see you next time.